Gladestalkers, fan out. Keep enemy eyes off of us. Soraka's brief pursuit of the undead commander ended not with closure, but with an ever-increasing sense of unease. He gazed down at his blood-stained claws, thoughts racing to make sense of the outcome. Mitra stood beside him, not a trace of her usual levity could be detected. How do things just keep getting worse? Hey, Jiraka said. You're sure this one was undead? Are you saying that she was a human collaborator? Soraka asked. There are idiots wherever you go, Jiraka shrugged. There were cases where the living encountered undead who were willing to coexist. Without a single exception, the living who fell for their overtures eventually discovered that they had committed a fatal error. That error not only cost them their lives, but also affected the lives of countless others. Coexistence with the living was simply a means to an end for the undead. Once that end was achieved, the undead reassessed the value of their living collaborators. Those collaborators were sometimes wrangled into some other venture, but they were most often killed off. In the case of the former, working together with the undead only made them more and more of a risk factor. For the undead, who harbored no notions of friendship, loyalty, or love toward the living, said risk factors became increasingly untenable and were inevitably eliminated. Unfortunately, as Jiraka noted, there were always idiots who thought they could trust the undead, or at least get something out of them, so undead beings who learned to exploit the desires of the living were never short of willing fools. My first thought was that she was Ulan, Soraka admitted. Even her stance looked like some derivative from their martial schools. That was the first of a long list of unsettling things about the undead commander. Undead spawned with a certain degree of martial expertise, but it was divided between the skills and abilities that all undead of their type had and mundane combat techniques. If one learned how to fight one Death Knight, one knew how to fight every Death Knight. This undead was different, however. Soraka could tell at a glance that she wasn't simply using what she had. Furthermore, what she had was martial arts. To his knowledge, undead beings could not use a warrior's magic no matter how powerful of a warrior they appeared to be. It implied that she both possessed the requisite skill and had grasped how to conceptualize martial arts. Since she was a commander, she might have attempted to train her soldiers and had passed on that knowledge. But how had she gained that knowledge in the first place? Had she infiltrated human society and learned? He still couldn't figure out what sort of undead she was. So you're saying that she wasn't human, Jiraka said. She got up after I hit her, Soraka said. I'm pretty sure I turned her insides into paste. No living thing survives that sort of ordeal. Not only did she walk away, but we found her running around rallying her troops with no sign of any injuries. There weren't any of those undead priests around, either. Well, Jiraka sniffed, she looks and smells like a human. Sure, undead might get away with the looking part, but not the smelling. Also, she's still there. The body, I mean. A type of evolved zombie, maybe? Mitra said. I ain't ever seen no zombies like that, Jiraka snorted. Body's not rotting or anything. If she were alive or whatever, old Iron'd probably ask her out for dinner. Soraka looked over at the corpse lying several meters away. Karavaki and two other sacred claws were still inspecting it and casting spells to prevent it from somehow getting up again. Certain undead left corpses, such as the aforementioned zombies if they were raised from corpses, but most powerful undead simply disintegrated after losing their animating force. They never existed as a corpse in the first place, so they similarly left nothing behind. If anyone came across Soraka and his entourage, they would have undoubtedly assumed that they had killed a human. There was absolutely no sign that she had ever been anything else. Karavaki, he said, is there any chance that this corpse is some form of magical or supernatural deception? Are you saying that she's not actually dead? Mitra looked around. I'm not sure what I'm saying, Soraka said. Nothing makes sense here. Summoned Death Knights. Undead commanders that leave behind fresh human corpses. Maybe she is still running around somewhere and this corpse is just some weird decoy manifested from an ability. Or maybe it's some contingency that she had handy for infiltrating human society. Nothing would surprise me at this point. There's no sign of this being some sort of deception. Karavaki walked over to stand on Soraka's right. That aside, the equipment on that corpse is real, which leads us to the biggest issue. Should we take it with us? Jiraka asked. Are you crazy? Mitra snarled. I thought she was wielding an astra when she landed in front of us. My fur nearly jumped off of my skin. So we just leave her there with her stuff? Normally, Soraka said, I'd say we use obscure object and take it with us. But this situation only grows more absurd with every new piece of information that we come across. Not only does she have something that looks like an Astra, but she has armor to match. One doesn't just randomly have complete sets of the stuff. Even single pieces are nearly impossible to find. The biggest issue was not the fact that the undead commander was wearing equipment, though that in itself was still a major cause for concern, but the appearance that the equipment took. Astra were divine relics with power beyond the artifice or even comprehension of the greatest talents that the Central Powers had to offer. If the corpse lying before them had real ones, their fight would have gone much differently. Considering that she was a tireless undead being and had considerable martial capabilities, she would have probably been able to wipe out Rolengork's forces on her own. This had been proven beyond a doubt in the past when the Beastman Confederacy thought it had gained an inexorable advantage over the Minos League. They attempted to exploit a generation's absence of any powerful divine-blooded champions and put an end to their destructive expansionism, only to have their expeditionary army obliterated by Astra left behind by the boastful sage. While the undead commander used imitation Astra, it was still enough to give anyone with the requisite knowledge pause. There were many implications to consider, and some were dire indeed. Maybe it was in that negative energy wasteland, Jiraka said. If it was buried in a tomb or something, it'd be hard for any of the living to find. That did make a sort of sense, though it was a stupid sort of sense. Many cultures buried great figures with their treasures, but the equipment in question was likely far beyond the value of the average national regalia. Most nations prudently passed that sort of equipment down to the next generation of defenders. Simply burying it meant that it ended up in the hands of whoever defeated them because they weren't using it. It's not worth the risk, Soraka said. Just leave everything as it is for now. We need to follow up with Rana Saj. Maybe whatever this undead formation was defending will have the answers we're looking for. If some random guy comes around and takes it, then we can track them with divination magic, Soraka said. Our sacred claws have already familiarized themselves with the items. This probably sounds terrible, but we can also find out if the items are in themselves a trap by seeing what happens to whoever takes them. Fair enough. Form up, we're moving out. Hold on, Karawaki said, we need to refresh some of our enchantments. Death Ward and a few other things are running out in less than 5 minutes. Hopefully, the undead commander was destroyed and that was the end of it. Next came whatever was on the hill, which he suspected to be a night lich that had developed a spell or skill that allowed them to create the Death Knights and other powerful undead beings that had rampaged their way across the Draconic Kingdom. The summoner's assets were deployed in the encirclement of Eastwatch and the reserve set aside for defense had been broken, so it should now be as vulnerable as it would ever be. Every individual in Clan Kira would be strictly weaker than their target, but they weren't so weak that they wouldn't be able to overwhelm it. The summoner probably wouldn't have enough mana to kill even a tenth of them in one battle. Of course, there was the possibility that the summoner immediately escaped or teleported away when it felt adequately threatened, but powerful undead had a certain degree of pride, or perhaps disdain, for the living that would at least see an attempt to show their opponents the folly of crossing them. Beside him, Mitra's ears swiveled all around. I don't hear any fighting coming from the hill, she said. Maybe it's over, Karawaki offered. Or maybe the target escaped, Jiraka said. I know for sure that a magic cast'd need more time than this to wipe out Clan Kira. Maybe we should have let them take out this commander while we went for the summoner. No one could tell how powerful the commander was, Soraka replied. With her equipped the way she was, I had to assume that Clan Kira would be destroyed. They might take massive casualties against a single Night Lich, but at least they would have a good chance of defeating it. If it stuck around. Yeah, well, those were our options at the time. Stop talking like a pretentious brat from the military academy. Jiraka shut his mouth. He hated being compared to academy brats. The last of the Gladestalkers came in. Kasturi went directly to him. Something's coming from the direction of the hill, she said. I don't know if they're here for us or here for that corpse, but they're heading straight this way along the road. Something? Soraka furrowed his brow, as in the undead? I can only assume so, Kasturi replied. They're human in appearance like the commander that we just destroyed. Some of Clan Kira's detached forces are still fighting against the Death Knights scattered about, and every time these humans come across them, they assist the undead. There are 9 Death Knights and 2 Elder Liches accompanying them now, plus a bunch of zombies that they've raised. Soraka released a long sigh. What about Rana Saj and Clan Kira's main force? He asked. If they were defeated, Kastori said, there's no sign of any survivors fleeing the area. More commanders? Or perhaps they were encountering a whole species of undead previously unknown to the Confederacy. What about their equipment? Karavaki asked. Are they wearing anything like the one we just destroyed? One of them is wearing a black suit. In the fashion of the far south. He has the look of an elderly human. The other is a girl in a black one-piece dress with black slippers and a black shawl. She's riding in the crook of the man's arm. The girl might be the same one I saw on top of the hill, but she was too far for any real details back then. Fashion from the far south? Yet another new thing that he couldn't ignore. Centimeter by centimeter, every piece of information was transforming this incident on the fringes of the continent into a catastrophe of global proportions. The dress might be a robe, Mitra said, so that makes the girl the one that summoned everything? The man carrying her around might be a bodyguard. It would explain why Clan Kira was defeated, Karavaki said. We only considered that there was a commander and a summoner. A powerful undead champion existing in addition to that should be next to impossible, but his garb presents a disturbing possibility. If they have a link with the far south, Soraka agreed, we'll have to send people to see if anything has changed along the Dreadlands. But first, we need to deal with this. He examined their surroundings, identifying the various tactical advantages offered by the terrain. As one achieved greater heights of power, they went far beyond the realities of most, but certain rules always applied. Gladestalkers, take positions along the ditches, keep the muddy fields between you and our targets. Try and get rid of the summoner as quickly as possible before supporting our warriors with the Death Knights. Mitra and I will fight the bodyguard. Sacred Claws, make sure you get dimensional anchor on the summoner just in case she tries to teleport away. Druids, unload everything you can on that bodyguard. The quicker we get this over with, the better. His entourage went about following his orders. The battle plan was a simple one, keep the Death Knights occupied while they hit the bodyguard and the summoner as hard as possible. Once they were out of the picture, nothing else would be a threat. Unless we find out that there's even more to this entire thing. A group of silhouettes appeared on the horizon, following the rural road towards Soraka's group. They resolved into the aged, human-looking bodyguard with the girl in black in the crook of his arm, accompanied by the Death Knights and Elder Liches. Minutes passed as they casually closed the distance. Soraka's eyes constantly moved over the surroundings, alert for any additional forces. Gee, something's moving in the shadows. We have more than Kastori reported to fight. So, shadows? Shadows were a type of undead, and they appeared just as they sounded, the shadowy figures of various living beings. They sapped their target's strength with a touch. Those that fell to them became shadows themselves. Greater shadows, going by how strong they look. A bit stronger, maybe. Watch out, they have greater shadows or something stronger lurking about as well. The undead group drew closer, and the oppressive air emanating from them grew. Like the undead commander, the summoner and the bodyguard lacked the characteristic crimson gaze of the undead, making it likely that they were dealing with a new undead species. Given what they had learned about the undead commander, they were the most dangerous type of undead ever encountered, too dangerous to be allowed to exist. How strong are the summoner and the bodyguard? I can't tell. They may as well be regular people. It was the same assessment that she gave the undead commander, indicating that they had some means to block attempts to directly gather information about them. The bodyguard's unfeeling gaze went from Soraka to the undead commander's corpse near the road. Soraka didn't wait for the reaction. Go. A ray shot out of Karavaki's hand, bathing the summoner in a green glow. 6 bullets flew in at the same time. The air crackled with electricity as his druids cast Call Thunderstorm using silent metamagic. 12 greater air elementals rushed forward, invisible to the naked eye. Soraka gathered himself to charge, then blinked as the bodyguard turned around and threw the summoner away. The summoner let out a squeak before landing in the flooded ditch with a splash. The bullets thumped against the bodyguard's back and fell to the road. 12 columns of divine flame lanced down from the sky, Flame strike spells simultaneously silent cast at their foe. The bodyguard dashed forward, somehow evading the bombardment. As their foe rushed forward, the thunderstorms were unleashed upon him. Their target seemed to leave after images of himself as he made his way. Soraka immediately dropped his offensive stance for a defensive one. How do you dodge 120 lightning bolts in a row? He was too strong. Even without a direct read, an experienced warrior could tell from their foe's movements alone. Soraka. The bodyguard blurred toward him. Soraka made the call. Evac. Jiraka interposed himself between the bodyguard and Soraka. A single blow laid him low, but the sliver of time he bought was all that was necessary. With a thought, Soraka activated a crystal inside his armor. The scenery shifted from the muddy fields of the Draconic Kingdom to the empty room of an inn. The cool, humid wind of the Riverlands was replaced by dry, sweltering heat. All around him, the members of his entourage teleported in. Soraka placed Jiraka's body on a nearby bed. "Resurrect him," he said. Soraka turned away and looked out of the crack in the window. In the plaza below the suite, the merchants of Stormport were preparing for the evening markets. His thoughts turned to the brief encounter and a dark mood fell upon him. The truth had revealed itself, but he wanted to deny it with all of his being. An unprecedented army of powerful undead. Those undead being summons in themselves. A new type of undead that displayed strange traits and acted outside of the bounds of characteristic undead behavior. The appearance of astral-like equipment and a being with the strength to fell a powerful dragon lord. Damn it all, Jiraka grumbled behind him. I don't get paid enough for this. I'll apply for a raise, Soraka chuckled. As if the department will loosen their claws on the budget. At least we had your body, Mitra quipped. We had to resurrect you from an old hairball last time. Kasturi wouldn't let you near her for a month. Soraka, Karuvaki said in a more subdued tone. What are we going to do? There's only one thing we can do, Soraka's voice grew grim. Contact Devi, we're going home. The cycle of calamity has begun anew, and it has come in a form that threatens all life. The entire world must prepare however it can. Droplets of water fell to the road as Draudilin dried herself off, the soaked fabrics of her dress clinging to every curve of her figure. A part of her was irked over the fact that Sabos didn't try to sneak a peek at her. Instead, the Sorcerer King's royal butler, or whatever he was, scanned the surroundings before going over to gently lift Baroness Zaradnik's remains from the muddy field nearby. He placed her on the grass alongside the road, an unreadable look on his handsome face. We assume that she will be resurrected? Draudilin said. Your Majesty is familiar with resurrection magic? Sabos asked. Crystal Tear had a cleric capable of casting it, Draudilin nodded. Their members died once in a while. The forces that came from the theocracy also had it available. We have become accustomed to powerful people having access to resurrection spells, and it is difficult to imagine the Sorceress Kingdom not having them. I see. Your Majesty is indeed correct. We will resurrect her at the soonest available opportunity. Pardon me for a moment while I deliver my report. Sabos went over to one of the elder liches accompanying them. Draudilin's gaze went to Baroness Zaradnik's body on the road. She released a tired sigh. Once again, my hesitance to act has led to trouble for everyone. Draudilin trembled. She had a feeling that, no matter what she did, hell was her destiny. Even with the security of her domain apparently well in hand, she was still confronted by an unpleasant choice. No matter how she twisted or turned, no matter how she hesitated and believed that she had escaped those unpleasant choices, the world reached out and snatched her back. Every time it did, she was placed before yet another unpleasant choice. Every time, it made a single demand: decide. The world wasn't very kind about it, either. Whenever she hesitated or ran away, she was punished. She wouldn't have minded it if it was some personal punishment, but what was meted out were consequences that happened to others. Those that she cared for. The denizens of her domain. People that relied on her or became close. And, as time went on, her punishment grew worse. Dragon Lords might not have had excellent parents to guide them, but they still had the world to answer to. To be born with the ability to wield the primal magic of the soul, wild magic, was to be born with a certain destiny. No, that made it sound too romantic. Fate was a better way to describe it. Every Dragon Lord was born to be something, and the world expected nothing less. As far as she knew, only a bare handful had managed to break themselves free of that fate. Ostensibly, it was to be what many with some insight on the matter called a keeper. It was an objectively better way to put it, as Dragon Lord led many mortals' thoughts in characteristically mortal directions. They envied or feared Dragon Lords for their power and knowledge, resented and hated them for ways that often set mortal priorities aside. Even those that befriended Dragon Lords and were informed of their nature couldn't understand. To truly understand, one had to be a keeper themselves. As her great-grandfather had so eloquently put it, Dragon Lords were the curators of a vast library, and every book, every story, was one of the countless souls that cycled through existence. Dragon Lords were regulators of the world's soul economy, charged with ensuring that the world as a whole remained healthy and continued to grow, becoming richer and more vibrant as the ages passed. Though the world had changed, souls still existed and thus their duty remained. Beyond that universal role, each Dragon Lord had a speciality. Some, like the Heavenly Dragon Lord, were born to destroy certain types of invaders that manifested from other existences and that had been his duty for eons. Most Dragon Lords, however, were merely gardeners tending to their respective plots around the world and were not too much stronger than the ancient dragons of the present day. What they were was sufficient for what they were meant to do, and Draudillan was the weakest of them all. Draudillan figured it was because she was born as a human. She was a human Dragon Lord taking care of a domain where humans were the predominant population. Humans were weak, and so was she. And, so, even before her coronation, she set about her task. It was already her domain the moment she was born, after all. Her mother, the queen at the time, couldn't understand what she was doing, thinking that she was playing at being a future queen and humoring her daughter's whimsies. To begin with, she wanted a country that was good. She couldn't guarantee that everyone was, but she could at least foster a society that encouraged what she desired. One that was built on integrity and trust, where people never selfishly abandoned their fellows or lived dishonest lives. A place where the best of humanity could thrive. As a Dragon Lord, she ensured that the environmental conditions in her domain were ideal for humans, and she did her best to guide them in the right direction. While she wasn't a human lord, she could use her limited capacity for wild magic to emulate some of their capabilities. The rest was simply a matter of study, which took time, but Dragon Lords had plenty of that. Of course, she couldn't coddle her subjects. Spoiling her people would only lead to decadence and warped worldviews. Her efforts were far from in vain. The Draconic Kingdom started to take the shape of the country of her dreams, and the people even came to reciprocate her care. It was a good country, one that prospered in times of peace and showed unparalleled resilience when troubles came. It was a place where people lived, loved, fought and died, writing characteristically good human stories in infinite variation. Someday, she thought, those stories would eventually make their way out into the world, enriching all of the other stories that they intertwined with. Yet, to her dismay, that future was barred to her people with malicious intent. As much as she loved humans, she also understood their faults. Foremost amongst them was that they did not handle power well. It was almost as if they were not meant to have power, as the result of their having power tended to result in terrible outcomes. The slain theocracy was the preeminent example of this. With the assuredness granted by their divine legacy, they tore down and rebuilt the world around them in their image, uncaring of the rest of its inhabitants. Whatever threatened their efforts that they couldn't exercise control over, they twisted, warped or destroyed outright. The Draconic Kingdom was no exception. Perhaps the worst part of it was that the theocracy followed the rules. Rules that kept Dragon Lords and other beings in the highest realms of power from directly intervening in their machinations. As their neighbor, Draudillan had little choice but to lock herself inside the cage that they built for her and her people. The world didn't care about that sort of thing, however. It was simply yet another trial, one that demanded various decisions out of her. And, now, events had transpired that forced her hand. The stories in her keeping were being robbed of the ability to write. Yet, even though she knew that she must act, acting came in fits and starts. She did one thing and stopped, prepared other things and stopped again. Hesitation stayed her hand, for her great-grandfather was right, she cared too much. Every soul was precious, be they human, beastman or anything else. Lord Sabos, one of the elder liches said, Reconnaissance reports a Beastman warband approaching from the northwest. All around her, the Death Knights took up a defensive stance. Sabos lowered his hand from his ear and tightened his pure white gloves, a grim expression on his face. He took a step forward. Draudilin stepped out of the ring of Death Knights, reaching out to grasp his elbow. "Sabos," she said. "Please, stop. I don't want you to do this anymore. I'll take care of this. I'll take care of everything." A slight frown marred Sabos' dignified face. "Forgive me, but I'm not sure that I understand what your Majesty is saying. The reason why I asked to come, why I was so happy that you would come with me, wasn't because I wanted you to fight. I was just happy that someone would be with me. Most of the time, that's all a girl needs." Draudilin stepped past Sabos. In the distance, the Beastman warband appeared, breaking out into a charge upon spotting them. "Also," she said softly, "if you can find it within you, please don't hate me after this." She closed her eyes. Herself reached out, coiling around the approaching Beastman. "Pay for the stories that you've ruined with your own. Learn what it means to intrude upon a Dragon Lord's domain. How dare you do this to the souls under my care?" A dozen lines went through her head, lines that she thought might encourage her to do what must be done. In the end, however, she could only say one thing: "I'm sorry." A tear trickled down her cheek. Then, she pulled. Agonized howls filled the air. The Beastmen slowed, then stopped. Most of them collapsed where they were, some of them crawled a short distance before doing the same. Draudilin traveled further, sweeping over the land. Hundreds of thousands of agonized voices screamed in her mind as she ripped away the soul of every Beastman in her domain. She wept silently as they fell where they stood, from Eastwatch to Forger Bay and throughout the Draconic Kingdom's southern provinces. "I'm sorry." One by one, she destroyed them, tearing their stories into shreds to fuel her spells. A storm of wild magic swept over the land, cleansing every well, stream, pond and lake. The bodies of her subjects were purged and their minds restored, every man and woman, every child and those yet to be born. As the Beastmen fell and their souls were taken, the people of the Draconic Kingdom were made whole again. In the end, she was left with quite a bit left over. The souls she had harvested were of far higher quality than average. Draudilin pondered what she would do with the rest. She turned her vision to the canyon past Eastwatch. "I could destroy the mountain range and turn the entire jungle into a lake." Her breath caught in her throat. What was she thinking? She released the souls to the world, collapsing onto the road with her face in her hands. Her shuddering sobs filled the deafening silence left in the wake of her atrocity. "Your Majesty," Sabos asked after some time, "were you always capable of doing that?" "With the suitable preparations, yes," she sniffed. "Then why?" "Because," Draudilin looked up at him, "because." She blinked as she looked at Sabos through her soul-charged vision. After witnessing him fight, she suspected, but now everything came together. "I see. So that's how it is. Dragon Lords did not come into existence by accident. Her birth, considered a miracle at a time when no new Dragon Lords could be born, was no stroke of incredible luck, but something that had happened by design. It was she who had been woefully mistaken when she thought it was to be the keeper of a human domain. Every moment of her life before this point was simply practice. Preparation for her true purpose. She was born as a human and placed in a position of weakness under a human nation blessed by the legacy of their gods. It was all schooling for when the real thing would come, and she had just graduated. Entities not of their world had manifested upon it, echoes of an existence called Yggdrasil. The world had even put her in the region where they were to appear. Draudilin was born not to guide humans, but to guide players who were reportedly very human-like in their behavior. Beings that possessed unfathomable power and more often than not lacked the experience to wield it appropriately. She was born after the advent of corruption and thus did not bear the resentment of the Dragon Lords who existed before that time. Everything that she was made her the ideal liaison between these newly arrived beings and the strange new world that they found themselves in. Well, Papa always said that the world doesn't usually play favorites. Her great-grandfather would probably keel over if he ever found out. Draudilin picked herself off of the ground and brushed off her knees. She looked up at Sabos again. "Because," she said, "there is a difference between can and should. If I'm not mistaken, you should understand that difference." "Yes, Your Majesty." Draudilin nodded. Please let His Majesty the Sorcerer King know that I look forward to our long and fruitful relationship. Of course, Sabos smiled his kind smile. I'm sure that His Majesty will be most pleased with your message. Ho, the royal army has become so good at waging war that enemy armies just fall over all at once after a bit of fighting. High above the Azalizian arsenal, in the headquarters of the Northern Army Group of the Royal Army of the Sorceress Kingdom, Ainzul Gaon, the Sorcerer King, leaned back in his seat of honor. It was a good thing that he was immune to cold, as the massive throne was carved out of pure ice. Even so, he had to suppress a shudder at the thought of his back touching the frozen surface. Ainz had been invited by Cocytus to witness the final battle of the Royal Army's campaign in the Draconic Kingdom, which Ainz had happily accepted. It wasn't statecraft, macroeconomics, magical theory or any other unfathomably complex thing, but warfare. Ainz was confident he would have at least some understanding of what was going on. He had just returned from a campaign in the Holy Kingdom at the beginning of the month, after all. All of his experiences were fresh and easy to remember, mostly. While much of what went on was new to the officers of the Royal Army, it wasn't a surprise to Ainz. It was obvious that the techniques and tactics developed by players in a game that had run for a decade or so would also be developed in a situation where the player base was an entire world and the systems they used had been in place for unknown centuries. Of course, that only applied to the tools that they possessed. Since there were very few, if any, high-level individuals around, he wouldn't expect any of the high-level practices that he was familiar with. When it came to low-level gameplay, however, the natives of their new world would likely outstrip any player from Yggdrasil. Both the Sorceress Kingdom's Adventurer Guild and the reports of the Imperial Army's operations proved this to be the case. Actually, why is it that the demi-humans seem to not only be stronger, but superior to humans in combat technique? I heard that Hater of a Paladin got pulled back then just like the Death Knights here did. There was only one thing he neither already knew about nor thought was obvious in hindsight, which was how the entire demi-human army just seemed to die all at once. Maybe it would come up in the post-battle discussion. Ah, Umu. Good work. It seems that everything more or less went as expected. The trap placed to draw any particularly strong forces toward a supposedly vulnerable position was especially clever. You have my compliments on that. Ha. Cocytus' characteristically forceful acknowledgement issuing not a meter from the throne nearly caused Ainz to jump. Ainz Summer. Your praise honors us. The general staff of the Royal Army of the Sorceress Kingdom settled into their places. After a moment, they began to pore over the results. At a certain point, they brought up the same question Ainz had been harboring. What do you suppose that was at the end, there? A frost giant captain who went by the name of Gunnar asked. I believe that the beastmen finally recognized the magnitude of affront they presented to the Supreme One and fell dead on the spot out of apology. Cocytus Insect Lieutenant spoke with such conviction that Ainz had to exchange a glance with the frost giants lined along the balcony. Yup, I'm not the crazy one here. I guess I'll have to wait for the reports from the officers on the field. Thankfully, while most of the natives in the region practiced some form of religion, the gods that they worshipped were less like the monotheistic religions still lingering on Earth that asserted that they followed some omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent god, and more like the deities of the various ancient mythologies that Yggdrasil heavily drew from for inspiration. As such, gods in the New World were more like folk heroes or some aspect of nature. They were limited in power, fallible, and had their respective interests and preferences as any regular person did. Some even had children with their followers, leaving lineages renowned for their divine blood. Ainz thought he could live with that, especially since he did indeed fit the description. Most of the demi-humans that had come under his reign offered their tributes and petitioned him for provision and protection against tangible problems which were well within Nazarik's capabilities to handle. They didn't expect the impossible or assume that he was possessed of unfathomable wisdom and intellect as Nazarik's denizens did. His gaze went back to the insect lieutenant, who was standing behind a stone table beside two others. If the Royal Army's leadership was always like this, the officers recruited out of the citizenry had an admirable amount of restraint and incredible poker faces. Not a single one of them twitched an eyebrow at the proposed explanation, but he was certain that they didn't believe a word of it. He cleared his non-existent throat, curious over what the gathered personnel had drawn from the conflict. Cocytus and his lieutenants must surely have come a long way from 2 years ago when they were tasked with attacking the lizardmen. Now, Ainz placed his hands on the armrests of his throne. I take it that this has been a valuable learning opportunity for everyone involved. Ha! Cocytus straightened where he stood to Ainz's right. Ainz Summer, for your approval, you have our utmost gratitude. Did I approve something like this? Albedo had kept him updated on Countess Corlin's preparations and plans to expand the Sorceress Kingdom's influence southeast in a way that promoted its benevolent foreign policy and would bring many economic benefits, which he had readily agreed to. The fact that the Draconic Kingdom had been occupied came to his attention, at least he thought it did, somewhere around or after the end of his time in the Holy Kingdom of Roblay. He couldn't remember the exact details or that anyone had even asked him about it, but if the royal army was there, he must have agreed to its deployment. There's no need. Ainz raised his bony palm outward in a stately gesture. Only a fool would let a golden opportunity like this pass them by, and I presume that none here are such fools. I would hear your thoughts on this campaign and any proposals you have on improvement based on your experiences. One of Cocytus' lieutenants, the insectoid who looked like a brown brain, rose from his seat. Or maybe it was lowered. It was so short that sitting on its chair made it seem taller. If I may speak, O Supreme One. Ainz inclined his head. While rare, the brain lieutenant said, the existence of outliers with power beyond that of what the locals call heroes presents an undeniable obstacle to the royal army's rank and file. Dispatching an esteemed personage such as Lord Sabos is hardly appropriate for every operation, never mind how Ainz Summer personally made an appearance in the Holy Kingdom. Oi, stop trying to trap me behind a desk. He believed he knew where they were coming from, but the notion was depressing. Even CEOs went on business trips and such, didn't they? The type of appearance that Nazarik's denizens thought appropriate for Ainz to make for state business was the exact type of appearance that he strove to avoid. As they often asserted, dirtying his hands by personally participating in battle was beneath him. Going around incognito as he did not long after their arrival was unthinkable. The Supreme Overlord, Ainz Ulgaun, deserved nothing less than to attend the highest profile functions, to be the centerpiece of all attention and discussion, filling everyone with awe at his wisdom, majesty and power. Or something like that. Of course, they wouldn't stop him if he did do the things that he wanted to, but that in itself made him feel guilty if he couldn't justify his actions. And how do you propose we address this issue? Ainz asked. Mercenaries, perhaps. No, mercenaries are not an option. But we can hardly use. Then how about? A lively debate erupted between Cocytus' lieutenants. While Ainz was pleased that they were exercising independent thought, they were all independently thinking in the same direction. Always power, huh? They had gone from standing in mused shock over their defeat at the hands of the lizardmen to being able to recognize key issues and discuss them. That in itself was good, but the solutions that they presented were still lacking. If a hammer wasn't enough, then they reached for a bigger hammer. It was most certainly within Nazarik's capabilities, but those capabilities had been sealed away for the vast majority of the Royal Army's exercise. Generally speaking, the Royal Army was meant to be exactly what it sounded like, the Royal Army of the Sorceress Kingdom. It was not the army of Nazarik, it was the army of the state that they had founded and was composed of the forces made available to it in everyday operations. Since his return from the Holy Kingdom, Ainz followed the campaign through the Royal Army's reports and occasionally dropped in to see how things were going, so he knew that many valuable lessons had been presented. If the Royal Army's only takeaway was that they needed more raw power, he would be disappointed indeed. The points of his eyes shifted in the direction of a goblin sitting at a table with several other goblins. He was dressed in archaic fashion, resembling a strategist from Earth's distant past. If clothes made the man, then certainly he would have some useful insight. You seem like you have something you wish to say, Ainz gestured at the goblin. Please do not hesitate to share on my account. I would like for everyone to participate in this discussion. The goblin rose from his seat, bowing low. Thank you, Your Majesty. He straightened again, holding his feather fan up to cover his mouth. Simply put, the goblin said, we lack unit cohesion. Unit cohesion. Ainz stroked his chin, as in teamwork? Indeed. The fan started to wave back and forth lightly. The strength of an army lies not in the strength of its individual soldiers, but in what they can achieve as a whole. The deployed squads did not operate as soldiers, they are simply groups of individuals that act as individuals once the fighting begins in earnest. I agree. A trickle of powder streamed from the ceiling at Gunner's rumbling voice. One could say that each squad is like a collection of champions, but only in the sense that they each possess the strength of a champion. Watching them fight is like watching a handful of berserkers going wild on the battlefield. The only time they fight as a unit is when the commanders are paying particular attention to their squads, but that is something that the sergeants are supposed to be responsible for. This squanders both the time and talent of our officers. They should be commanding, not herding a bunch of seagoods. Hey! The frost giant beside the speaker shot him a hurt look. Chuckles rose from the assembled staff. I mean no disrespect to our troops who fought in the Draconic Kingdom, the goblin with the fan said, but I believe they are auxiliary forces meant for domestic policing duties. The soldiers of the Northern Army Group would not commit the same errors. While our forces in the Draconic Kingdom may have overpowered the Beastmen, it pains me to say that the Beastmen fought better. Both their soldiers and officers were superior in terms of discipline and technique. On both a professional and, I suppose Captain Zaradnik would say a political level, this is entirely unacceptable. While he hadn't been able to put it in words, what the goblin said was in line with what Ainz felt. In Yggdrasil, if one was bested by another player, how one took the loss depended on the circumstances. If there was a level gap, one would grind to close the gap. The same thing would apply to equipment. Problems with the build would be identified and corrected. If an opponent was too strong to solo, they would bring in others to help. Some of the aforementioned things were much more difficult to achieve in their new world, but the stakes were also much higher. It was reality, after all. One couldn't log off in frustration and do something else, nor could one easily go elsewhere because others occupied that space. You are exactly right. Ainz folded his hands before him and leaned forward. The Sorceress Kingdom must be superior to all others on every level. Those who wish to fight will find reasons to do so, and they will do so according to their advantages, not ours. If they cannot match us in a direct confrontation, then they will find other means. If we cannot prove that we are capable of matching them in every arena, we will have troublemakers believing that they can get away with their schemes whenever our backs are turned. Albedo already understands this and has been working hard to make the civilian end of things watertight. I expect no less of the Royal Army. It was already abundantly clear that they could command fear. Now, they needed to command respect. In the past, he believed it better to be feared than respected, but time and experience revealed the limits of fear and how it could lead to undesirable outcomes. Instilling too much of it made it hard to switch gears after the fact. Does anyone else have any insights to share? Ainz asked. Cocytus answered with a blast of frigid air. In the future, intervention in crises, expedient. Those in need, we should seek. To lend our strength. Ainz nodded. It does indeed seem that way. Even the Holy Kingdom was amenable to our assistance once Yaldabaoth made his move. About that. Cocytus paused, then seemed to collect himself. Unnecessary. Demiurge's intellect, I respect, but this world, filled with strife. Many would welcome help. Fabricating crises, dishonorable. The warrior's way, it is not. So he did feel that way. Ainz had wondered about it since Demiurge outlined his plans for the Holy Kingdom, but, whenever one of the three great minds of Nazarick cooked something up, challenges were next to non-existent. Everyone assumed that their proposals were the best possible avenue for Nazarick to take, and service to the Supreme Beings superseded any notion of personal honor. Personally, Ainz didn't care too much about personal honor, but it was still a point to consider. Schemes that blew up tended to do so in the most unpleasant of ways, and a tarnished reputation was insanely difficult to repair. A single bit of bad press could foil the efforts of an entire marketing campaign, and even the megacorporations back on Earth had to burn unimaginable amounts of money and man-hours performing damage control for a single minor incident. The Sorceress Kingdom already had a tremendous handicap due to its association with the undead. Being perceived as a bastion of evil made outsiders more than willing to believe that they were guilty of any wrongdoing pinned on them. Upon his arrival in Robley, he had been unpleasantly surprised to overhear the various rumors that had drifted through Riestais about Erantal being turned into a literal hell. What you say holds merit, Ainz said, but it would require that we expand our intelligence network. We'll see how things are going in a few years once we're done with Riestais. And, even if we do decide to embark upon the route that you suggest, I won't suspend any operations in progress without good reason. Also, we may deem it necessary for specific circumstances in the future. I will not deny the Sorceress Kingdom a powerful tool by dismissing the option out of hand. That would probably give everyone enough room to work with. Demiurge likely already had several plots in progress and Ainz didn't want to step on any toes. The goings-on in Riestais were also part of an engineered crisis fomented by a group of local collaborators. The scenery in the mirror of remote viewing shifted around as Entema scanned over the Royal Army's advancing forces. Most of what they saw consisted of the undead checking through the remains of the Beastman army, poking at corpses and investigating the content of their camps. Speaking of corpses, there's something I should check on. Ainz rose from his seat. Now then, he said. I understand that there is much more to say on what you've learned here, but an informal discussion will hardly do everything justice. I look forward to seeing your thoughts and proposals on paper. He summoned Shaltir to his side with a regal gesture and stepped into the gate that she summoned. The orange glare of sunset warmed his robe the moment he appeared in front of the great tomb of Nazarick. Corpses from the battle were already arriving through another gate summoned by Pestonia. Solution, who was currently the maid on entrance duties, bowed low before him. Welcome back, Ainz Summer. Umu. I'm back. Solution fell into step behind them as they entered the front cabin. After passing through the teleportation gate, Shaltir spoke. My most sincere apologies, Ainz Summer, she said. What for? My vassal failed to accomplish her task. A petite frown crossed Shaltir's doll-like face. Her distraught expression drew a chuckle out of him. Could it be that you feel that our victory has been marred in some fashion? How else could I feel? Shaltir pouted. Ludmilla did so well in the Empire, so I thought it would be the same in the Draconic Kingdom. And then she went and died in the final battle. As the Floor Guardian responsible for her, I am filled with shame at her failure. Observing Baroness Zaradnik was an awkward process. Since she had a ring of non-detection, they could only tell where she was by following the elder lich assigned as her adjutant. When she left the adjutant behind, they had to follow the troops she was leading. If she fought, the scene in the mirror of remote viewing was somewhat comical as beastmen just seemed to fall apart on their own. Her death was second-hand information from aerial observers. Annoyingly, the beastmen that had killed her were also employing a non-detection effect or something similar enough to it. In all, the experience was reminiscent of the early days of Yggdrasil, when no one had a solid grasp of information warfare yet and trying to remotely keep track of people was very much hit and miss. That being said, just because they couldn't see her didn't mean that she wasn't doing her job. Nor was the fact that she died. Did she? Ainz said as they strolled through the catacombs of the first floor, where elder liches were performing last-minute security checks on the delivered bodies before they were sent into cold storage. As I recall, her role was rather limited. That aside, she did not disobey any of the General Staff's orders, nor did she abandon her post. This was the Royal Army's exercise and she was merely an officer on the field fulfilling her duties. Furthermore, her counterattack against the enemy's pull tactic was as good as one can ask for in the situation that the army found itself in, and she never gave up trying to rally her shattered forces. MMH. Shaltir's brow creased in thought. It wasn't as if he couldn't empathize. As the senior officer on the field, Baroness Zaradnik had accomplished her tasks with little room for complaint. Getting sideswiped on the home stretch was understandably frustrating. He considered his own experiences in the Holy Kingdom of Roble, thinking about the country's resistance efforts and the many challenges they faced. These two conflicts we've participated in recently. Ainz stared up at the catacombs ceiling. Do you know what I found the most striking about them? What would that be, Ainz Summer? The scale, Ainz replied. The sheer vastness and complexity of everything. All of the rules we are accustomed to take on brand new meanings as a result, and the realities of this world were made all too evident. At the Battle of Katza Plains, Ainz thought he had a good idea of what war was like in their new world. But, now, he knew that he was sorely mistaken. The Battle of Katza Plains was more of a formal challenge where two sides agreed to an honorable contest following rules that everyone respected. If he were to be honest with himself, he had broken those rules in his ignorance over them by doing what he did, but what was done was done. The conflicts in the Holy Kingdom and the Draconic Kingdom, however, weren't anything like that. Combatants exploited every conceivable advantage and attacked every discernible weakness. Unfair only meant do it more. No one stood around waiting to get swatted by something far more powerful if they could help it. It was a dirty, chaotic business where everything was allowed and there was a real cost incurred for every action. Theaters of battle could cover hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, millions, if multiple countries were involved. Managing everything required supernatural capabilities, and he figured that this was where commander classes fit into the grand scheme of things. When he saw the encirclement of Eastwatch by a mere 20 infantry squads, he couldn't help but think that the encirclement was 99.9% holes. Yet they managed it, and it was likely due to Baroness Saradnik's expertise in manipulating perception and leading her opponents along the lines of thought she desired of them. When Demiurge made his opening move against the Holy Kingdom, he made sure to eliminate every general and their officers. Once that happened, all the Northern Holy Kingdom's resistance forces could do was flail about in laughably naive ways until Ainz arrived to perform his part of Demiurge's script. As a floor guardian, he said, you defend these narrow corridors, yet the total area of all three of your floors combined is but a fraction of the area managed by a single farming village. We all fought in these circumstances. Even fighting in Yggdrasil's outdoor areas can't be compared. Wars between guilds might involve hundreds of players, but the wars here sweep up millions. A fireball, if well placed, could damage half of an invading guild. Here, it might open a hole in a formation and kill an insignificant number of soldiers as far as an army's total numbers are concerned. The scope of things is so huge that losses for every side are inevitable. Shiltir tilted her head back and forth as he spoke, her expression of thought deepening even further. Is that one of the reasons why Ainz Summer founded the Royal Army, aren't you? She asked, and why Demiurge invaded the Holy Kingdom the way that he did. Indeed, Ainz nodded. How many fiends do you think Demiurge lost during that entire venture? A handful of mercenaries were sacrificed as well, and the data used for those is lost to us forever. The Royal Army, on the other hand, is sustainable. It deploys assets that are cheap to maintain and easy to replace or recover. Come to think of it, as the guardian of the first, second, and third floors, shouldn't you already think like this? Think like what, Ainz Summer? Well, anyone invading Nazarick comes through your floors first, right? It happened all the time. Players come in and poke around here and there or see how far they can get. We always drove them away, but not before they destroyed many of your vassals. You've likened Baroness Saradnik to an area guardian in the past. If one of your area guardians was destroyed, would it be something to be ashamed of or infuriated over? Of course not. We are all proud to die in the defense of the Supreme Being's abode. Actually, if there's one thing that Kyuhyuku is displeased about, it's the fact that he's died far fewer times than the others. The reason that Kyuhyuku died far fewer times than the others, he died fewer times than Shiltir, even, was that players did their best to avoid him if they could help it. Ainz wasn't sure whether he would console him over his low score or the fact that he was a giant cockroach. So you mean to say that I should be proud of her dying, aren't you? Shiltir asked. Should I tell her to be happy about it as well? Maybe. It's not something to be ashamed of, at least. She fulfilled her duties even in the face of death. Speaking of which, they stepped into the next teleportation gate, which was configured to send the inspected corpses to the 5th floor. The Frost Virgin guarding the landing lowered her head respectfully. Welcome, Ainz Summer. How may I be of assistance? We're here for Baroness Saradnik's corpse, Ainz said. It should have arrived by now. This way, please. Ainz followed the Frost Virgin through the towering rows of bodies in frozen storage. He came by once to expend his daily limit of undead creation skills, but they were usually brought to the teleportation gate to save time. With the Frost Virgin leading them through the area like some warehouse staff member, he felt like he was back at his old job, except instead of checking on shipments of merchandise, he was dealing with bodies. Corpses are something like a commodity here, I think. Over a third of his citizens would happily eat the inventory that they were strolling by. Considering the attitudes of the various demi-humans he had interacted with, butcher shops around the world might have meat lockers filled with dead people and no one would think it strange. They arrived at a portion of the 5th floor that was less warehouse-like in appearance. Here, corpses of particular note or potentially high value were stored. Through the blowing snow, a silhouette appeared. It resolved into the figure of Pestonia as they got closer. Nazarick's head maid, or housekeeper, as the locals called them, stood with her hands held palm out before her. On the snow was why? True resurrection. Too late. Pestonia's spell washed over Baroness Saradnik's body. The head maid turned to regard them, lowering her head respectfully. "Ein Summer. It's so wonderful to see you, as always. One. Has something brought you to this part of the 5th floor? One." Her gaze followed his to the corpse on the snow beside her. "Oh, my. Have I done something I shouldn't have? Since she fell in the line of duty, I figured it was appropriate to." No," Ein said. "It's fine. We haven't come to punish her or anything like that. We're here for an experiment." Yes, an experiment. He wasn't sure what to call it. Since the Baroness was a revenant, he figured that she would come back from the dead on her own and rushed over to see if it would happen. In Yggdrasil, the time varied depending on what sort of content the revenant was a part of, but the ones that players encountered in outdoor camps could get back up in less than 30 seconds and endlessly pester whoever killed them. Beside him, Shaltir gazed down at the Baroness' body with glistening eyes. A rosy flush rose on her cheeks and she licked her lips. "Damn it, Pereroncino, why did you have to include that fetish?" "Because she's undead," obviously was probably the answer. His friend's perverse logic always caused no end of problems. "I see," Pestonia said. "No, you don't. Also, you forgot your one." As far as he knew, only a handful of people were aware of Baroness Saradnik's true nature. It seemed like a sensitive topic for her, and revealing the truth might cause widespread panic over humans being transformed into undead, so Ainz figured it was fine to keep things the way they were. Shaltir walked toward the Baroness' corpse, her black ballroom gown collecting bits of blowing snow. She leaned forward with a curious look. "She didn't resurrect," Shaltir noted. "Yes," Pestonia rested her cheek in a gloved hand, "the spell had no effect. Was that part of your experiment, Ein Summer? One could say that it counts as an observation." "Is that so? In that case, I shan't disturb you. Please forgive your humble servant for her meddling." Pestonia curtsied before gathering her skirts to walk in the direction of the teleportation gate. Ainz's attention turned back to Baroness Saradnik's corpse. So the resurrection had no effect, not as in rejected but immune? Did someone tamper with the corpse before Sabos got to it? But Pestonia used true resurrection. Even true death doesn't block that. Had the natives of this world developed some extremely nasty form of resurrection prevention? Something like that couldn't exist in Yggdrasil for balance purposes, but there were no developers here telling the magic researchers of this world what they weren't allowed to do. No, maybe that's too much. Martial arts are one thing, but tier magic is tier magic. Even if they develop new spells, they should be limited by the power of the tiers that the spells are in. The Beastmen didn't have any powerful casters. What if it was a skill or ability? That was probably the most unsettling aspect of their new world. The natives seemed to endlessly develop new things. There was no guarantee that those developments wouldn't pose a threat to Nazarick, so trying to figure out how the systems of the world worked and what their limitations were was one of Nazarick's greatest priorities. Mayor, Pandora's actor, and several others were tasked with finding out as much as they could, but progress was slow due to the general ignorance and the low levels of the local population. The sound of a scratching pen filled the air as Shaltir added to her notes in Pereroncino's encyclopedia. She was as diligent as always when it came to the things that she cared about. "Do you have any ideas, Shaltir?" Ainz asked. "Maybe she'll get up when she feels like it," Shaltir answered. "I can't imagine her staying down for very long." Hopefully, that was all there was to it.